The desert sun beat mercilessly against Zachary Walsh's weathered face as he spotted what appeared to be a bundle of fabric on the horizon, until he realized it was a woman, collapsed face down on the trail. Her auburn hair splayed across the dusty earth like a halo of fire against the scorched terrain. Arizona Territory. 1878, Zachary pulled back on the reins of his chestnut stallion, bringing the beast to a halt at the edge of the narrow trail that wound its way through the unforgiving landscape. The woman wasn't moving. For a moment, he considered riding on a lone cowboy in these parts had to be cautious of traps, but something about the stillness of her form drew him closer. His weathered boots hit the dusty ground with a soft thud as he dismounted, approaching her with caution, one hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. "Madam," he called, his voice rough from days without proper conversation. When she didn't respond, Zachary knelt beside her, gently turning her over. She was alive, but barely. Her face, though smudged with dirt and marked by days in the punishing sun, still held a delicate beauty that caught him off guard. Her lips were cracked from dehydration, her breathing shallow. Without a second thought, he reached for his canteen and carefully tipped a small amount of water between her parched lips. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Zachary looked around at the vast emptiness surrounding them. The nearest town, Prescott, was at least 4 days' ride, and that was if he pushed hard. He couldn't leave her here, that would be a death sentence. "Don't you worry, madam," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "I'll get you somewhere safe." With a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior, Zachary lifted her lightweight frame. She was feather-light in his arms, worryingly so, suggesting she hadn't eaten properly in days. He secured her on his horse before mounting behind her, one arm holding her steady against his chest as he urged his mount forward. As they rode, the woman occasionally stirred, mumbling incoherently before slipping back into unconsciousness. Zachary kept a vigilant eye on the horizon, wary of both the natural dangers of the desert and the human predators who might see them as easy targets. When dusk fell, he made camp in the shelter of a rocky outcrop. He laid the woman on his bedroll, using his saddle as a pillow for her head. In the glow of the small fire he built, he finally got a proper look at her. She wore a simple dress, once fine but now tattered and stained. Around her neck hung a small silver locket. Her hands, though dirty, showed no calluses, not the hands of someone accustomed to hard labor. Zachary dampened a cloth with precious water from his canteen and gently cleaned her face. Her skin was pale beneath the sunburn, making him wonder what a woman like her was doing out alone in such unforgiving territory. As he tended to her, she suddenly gasped and opened her eyes of the clearest green he'd ever seen, like the rare desert pools he sometimes stumbled upon during spring rains. They darted wildly, filling with fear as they focused on him. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe." She tried to speak but could only manage a hoarse whisper. "Water," she finally croaked. Zachary helped her sit up slightly, supporting her head as she sipped from his canteen. "Who?" she managed after drinking. "Name's Zachary Walsh. Found you collapsed on the trail about 10 miles back. You've been out cold most of the day." He kept his voice steady, non-threatening. "Might I ask your name, madam?" She swallowed hard, wincing at the pain in her throat. "Grace," she whispered. "Grace Keller." "Well, Miss Keller, you picked a mighty dangerous place to take a rest." He tried for a light tone, relieved when the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. "Not by choice." Her voice was gaining strength, though still barely audible. "I figured as much. Think you can eat something? Got some jerky and beans, not fancy, but it'll keep you going." She nodded weakly. As Zachary prepared a small portion of his provisions, Grace's eyes followed his movements, wary but grateful. "Why? Why help me?" she asked as he handed her a tin plate. Zachary considered her question, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames of their small campfire. Out here, you don't leave folks to die. Simple as that. It was a principle he'd lived by, despite everything he'd seen and experienced in his 30 years. The war had taken much from him: his youth, his innocence, his faith in humanity, but not his fundamental decency. Not yet, anyway. "Thank you," Grace whispered, managing a few small bites before exhaustion overtook her again. Zachary kept watch through the night, alert to every sound in the darkness. By morning, Grace's fever had worsened. Her forehead burned under his touch, and she muttered deliriously. He knew then that their journey would be longer and more arduous than he'd anticipated. For 3 days, Zachary carried Grace through the harsh terrain, stopping only when necessary, rationing their dwindling supplies with increasing concern. When she was lucid, he learned fragments of her story. She'd been traveling west with a wagon train, but separated from the group during an Apache raid. She'd been wandering for days, disoriented and without supplies, before collapsing where he found her. On the 4th day, as they sheltered from the midday heat beneath a rocky overhang, Grace's fever finally broke. Zachary had been dozing lightly when he felt her stir against him. He opened his eyes to find her looking at him, truly seeing him for the first time. "You're still here," she said, her voice stronger than before. "Said I'd get you somewhere safe. Haven't managed that yet." He offered her water, which she accepted gratefully. "How long have you been carrying me?" 4 days now. You've been in and out." Grace's eyes widened. 4 days. "But your supplies, your water, we're managing." He didn't tell her how he'd been taking smaller rations for himself, ensuring she had enough. Grace pushed herself up to a sitting position, grimacing at the stiffness in her limbs. "I need to try walking," she insisted. "I can't be your burden anymore." "You're no burden, Miss Keller." "Grace," she corrected him. "After carrying me for 4 days, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." A smile tugged at the corner of Zachary's mouth. "Grace, then." With his help, she stood on shaky legs. Her first steps were uncertain, but she was determined, gripping his arm for support as they walked a short distance from their shelter. By evening, though tired, she insisted on walking alongside his horse for short stretches, resting when necessary. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Walsh," she said as they made camp that night, her voice still weak but gaining strength. "What brings a man like you to this wilderness alone?" Zachary hesitated, unused to talking about himself. "Not much to tell. Been moving around since the war ended. Worked ranches mostly. Was heading to Prescott to meet an old friend who's got work for me there." Grace studied him in the firelight. "You're being modest, I think. A man doesn't survive out here, doesn't know how to care for a half-dead stranger without having some story worth telling." Zachary poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the darkening sky. "Was a cavalry scout during the war. Learned to read the land, find water, stay alive. After, couldn't settle nowhere. Too many ghosts." He paused. "Your turn." "What takes a lady like yourself across Apache territory with a wagon train?" Grace looked down at her hands. "I was a schoolteacher in Boston. After my father died last year, there was nothing left for me there." She twisted the silver locket around her neck. "I answered an advertisement for teachers needed in San Francisco. The journey west seemed like a fresh start." "That's a long way to go for a fresh start," says the man who wanders the desert alone, she replied, a hint of spirit in her voice that made Zachary smile despite himself. As days passed and they continued their slow journey toward Prescott, Grace grew stronger. She still rode Zachary's horse for most of the day, but insisted on walking beside him for longer periods, determined to pull her weight. Their conversations deepened, flowing more easily with each passing mile. Zachary found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone about growing up on a small farm in Kentucky, about the horrors he'd witnessed during the war, about the restlessness that had driven him west afterward. Grace listened without judgment, offering her own tales of life in Boston, her dreams of adventure, her fear that she'd made a terrible mistake in leaving everything familiar behind. "You regret it?" Zachary asked one evening, a week into their journey. "Coming west?" Grace considered the question, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "I should, shouldn't I, after everything that's happened?" She shook her head. "But no. Despite it all, I feel more alive here than I ever did in Boston, even when I was dying on that trail." She looked at him then, her green eyes reflecting the dying light. "Is that strange?" "No," he answered quietly. "I understand that feeling well enough." On the 10th day, they crested a ridge and saw smoke from chimneys in the distance. Prescott at last. Grace felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Their journey was ending. Soon, Zachary would deliver her safely to civilization and they would part ways. "We'll reach town by nightfall," Zachary said, his expression unreadable. Grace nodded, her throat suddenly tight. I can never repay you for what you've done, Zachary." He looked at her then, his blue eyes intense. "Never asked for payment. I know. That's what makes it impossible to repay." They made their way down the ridge in silence, both lost in thoughts neither dared express. Prescott was a bustling frontier town, its main street lined with wooden buildings, saloons, and shops. People turned to stare as they rode in, Zachary dusty and trail-worn. Grace perched in front of him, her once fine dress in tatters but her head held high. Zachary took her directly to the town's small hotel. The proprietress, a stout woman named Mrs. Holcomb, took one look at Grace and clucked her tongue. "Land's sake, child, what happened to you?" Before Grace could answer, Mrs. Holcomb turned her attention to Zachary, eyes narrowing suspiciously. "And who might you be, sir?" "Zachary Walsh, madam. Found Miss Keller collapsed on the trail about 10 days back. She was separated from her wagon train during an Apache raid." Mrs. Holcomb's expression softened slightly. "Well, you poor dear. Let's get you settled with a hot bath and a proper meal." She gave Zachary a assessing look. "And I suppose you'll be wanting a room as well, Mr. Walsh." Zachary shifted uncomfortably. "Just seeing the lady safely situated, madam. I've got business elsewhere in town." Grace felt a stab of disappointment but kept her expression neutral. "Thank you for everything, Zachary," she said formally, extending her hand. He took it briefly, his calloused palm rough against her softer one. "It was no trouble, Grace." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "You take care now." And then he was gone, striding back out into the dusty street, leaving Grace with a strange hollowness in her chest. The next few days passed in a blur of recovery. Mrs. Holcomb, who had taken an immediate liking to Grace, helped her acquire new clothing and introduced her to several prominent townspeople. Grace was overwhelmed by the kindness shown to her offers of lodging, employment, assistance in contacting the authorities about the wagon train attack. "The schoolteacher position is still open," Mrs. Holcomb told her over breakfast 3 days after her arrival. "The last one left to get married 6 months ago. Town council's desperate for someone educated to teach the children." Grace found herself considering it. Prescott wasn't San Francisco, but it was a growing town with potential. And something about the rugged landscape around it called to her in a way the crowded streets of Boston never had. Have you seen Mr. Walsh in town?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Holcomb's eyes twinkled knowingly. "He's been by the sheriff's office. Apparently, he's got quite a reputation as a tracker, sheriffs trying to convince him to take a deputy position." She buttered her biscuit. Handsome man, if a bit rough around the edges. Grace felt her cheeks warm. He saved my life. I owe him a proper thank you at least. Was all Mrs. Holcomb said, but her smile spoke volumes. That afternoon, Grace ventured out alone for the first time since arriving in Prescott. The town was smaller than she'd initially thought, a central hub surrounded by scattered homesteads and ranches. The main street bustled with activity: cowboys, miners, shopkeepers, and families going about their business. She walked slowly, still regaining her strength, taking in the sights and sounds of what might become her new home. She was examining the wares in a shop window when a reflection caught her attention: a tall figure in a worn leather vest and dusty hat standing across the street, watching her. Her heart quickened as she turned to face him. Zachary looked different in town, still rugged, but he'd clearly bathed and shaved, his dark hair trimmed and his clothes less trail-worn. He crossed the street toward her, removing his hat as he approached. "Miss Keller, good to see you on your feet." "Mr. Walsh," she replied, suddenly formal despite the 10 days they'd spent in each other's constant company. "I was hoping to run into you. I wanted to thank you properly for everything you did for me." He shifted uncomfortably. "Told you wasn't expecting thanks." "Nevertheless, you have mine." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Holcomb mentioned you might be staying in Prescott." Zachary looked surprised. "Been considering it. Sheriff's offered me a position, and my friend's ranch needs hands." He studied her face. "What about you, moving on to San Francisco?" Grace shook her head. "I've been offered the teaching position here. After everything that's happened, I'm inclined to take it. It seems serendipitous." A small smile touched Zachary's lips. "Big word for a bit of good luck." "Perhaps more than luck," Grace said quietly, holding his gaze. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then a voice called Zachary's name from down the street, breaking the spell. He glanced over his shoulder at the approaching sheriff. "I should go," he said, turning back to Grace. "But maybe we could continue this conversation over dinner. If you're feeling up to it." Grace smiled, a genuine, full smile that transformed her face. "I'd like that very much." That dinner marked the beginning of something neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. Over the following weeks, as Grace settled into her role as Prescott's new schoolteacher, and Zachary took the deputy position, they found reasons to cross paths daily. Sometimes it was Zachary escorting her home after school, other times Grace bringing him lunch at the sheriff's office. They shared meals at the hotel restaurant, took Sunday walks through town, and gradually revealed more of themselves to each other. Grace learned that Zachary had lost his entire family during the war, his parents to illness, his younger brother to a Confederate bullet. He'd been wandering ever since, unable to settle, haunted by memories he couldn't outrun. In turn, she told him about her strict Boston upbringing, her father's disappointment when she chose teaching over marriage to his business partner, the suffocating grief after his death that had propelled her westward. "You miss it?" Zachary asked one evening as they sat on the hotel porch watching the sunset. "Boston, I mean. Proper society and all that." Grace considered the question. "I miss certain things. Books, music, the changing of the seasons." She smiled wryly. "Clean streets." Zachary chuckled. "Can't argue with that. But I don't miss the constraints," she continued. "The endless rules about what a woman can and cannot do. Out here, there's a freedom I never knew existed." She glanced at him. "What about you? Do you miss Kentucky?" "Haven't thought about it in years," he admitted. "Nothing there for me now, but lately." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Lately," Grace prompted gently. Zachary stared out at the darkening horizon. "Lately, I've been thinking it might be nice to have somewhere to belong again." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Grace's heart quickened. Before she could respond, the hotel door opened, and Mrs. Holcomb stepped onto the porch. "Evening, you two. Beautiful sunset, isn't it?" The older woman smiled knowingly. "Don't mind me, just checking if you'll be wanting coffee after dinner, Miss Keller." The moment was broken, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of deeper feelings neither had been ready to voice until now. As autumn settled over the Arizona territory, Prescott prepared for its annual harvest festival. Despite the harsh desert surroundings, the settlers were determined to maintain traditions from back east. The town square was decorated with bunting and hay bales, tables laid out for a community feast, and a space cleared for dancing. Grace threw herself into helping with preparations, working with her students to create decorations and rehearse songs to perform. The night before the festival, she stayed late at the schoolhouse, finishing paper lanterns with a few of the older girls. "Miss Keller," said Emma, a 12-year-old with bright eyes and a quick mind, "is Deputy Walsh going to ask you to dance tomorrow?" Grace nearly dropped the lantern she was holding. "That's a very forward question, Emma." The girl grinned unrepentantly. "My pa says it's plain as day that the deputy's sweet on you, and Mrs. Holcomb told my ma that she hasn't seen a more perfect match since her own daughter married." "Is that so?" Grace tried to sound stern but couldn't suppress a smile. "Well, Mrs. Holcomb and your father should mind their own business." "But is he," Emma persisted, "going to ask you to dance?" Grace sighed. "I don't know, Emma. That would be for Deputy Walsh to decide." "If he doesn't, my big brother said he'd ask you instead," piped up another girl, sending them all into fits of giggles. By the time Grace shooed the girls home and locked up the schoolhouse, the sun had set and the streets were dark. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the autumn chill and started toward the hotel. "Little late to be out alone, isn't it, Miss Keller?" Grace startled at the voice, then relaxed as Zachary stepped out of the shadows. "Deputy Walsh, you frightened me. Apologies." Was passing by and saw the light in the schoolhouse. He fell into step beside her. "Festival preparations." "Yes, the children are very excited. Whole town is. Been a hard year for many. Everyone's looking forward to the celebration." They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments. Grace was acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid and reassuring in the darkness. "I've been meaning to ask you," Zachary said suddenly, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "about tomorrow's festival." Grace's heart skipped. "Yes." "I was wondering if you might—" The crack of a gunshot cut him off, followed by shouting from the direction of the saloon down the street. Zachary's hand immediately went to his revolver. "Get inside," he ordered, all hesitation gone from his voice. "Now." Before Grace could respond, more shots rang out. Zachary pushed her toward the nearest doorway, then took off running toward the disturbance, drawing his weapon as he went. Grace watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart pounding with fear not for herself, but for him. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. She loved him. Somewhere between collapsing on that desert trail and this moment, she had fallen in love with Zachary Walsh. She stood frozen in the doorway, straining to hear what was happening. More shouting, another shot, then silence. The minutes stretched endlessly until finally, figures emerged from the saloon, the sheriff, Zachary, and a man in handcuffs between them. Relief flooded through her. When Zachary returned to escort her the rest of the way to the hotel, she couldn't stop herself from reaching for his hand. He looked surprised but didn't pull away. "Are you all right?" she asked, searching his face in the dim light. "Fine, just a drunk prospector causing trouble." He squeezed her hand. "Sorry about the interruption. What I was trying to say earlier. I was wondering if you'd do me the honor of saving me a dance tomorrow." Grace smiled up at him. "I'd be delighted to, Deputy Walsh." The Harvest Festival transformed Prescott. For one day, the harsh realities of frontier life were set aside as the community came together to celebrate. Tables groaned under the weight of food, fiddle music filled the air, and children ran laughing through the crowded square. Grace wore her best dress, a new one she'd purchased with her first teacher's salary, deep blue with lace at the collar and cuffs. She'd arranged her auburn hair more carefully than usual, pinning it up with the tortoiseshell combs her mother had given her before she died. When Zachary spotted her across the square, he stopped mid-conversation with the sheriff, his expression making her blush. He looked different today too. Gone was the dusty deputy, replaced by a clean-shaven man in a pressed shirt and new vest, his dark hair slicked back beneath his best hat. "Miss Keller," he said when he reached her, his voice low. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Deputy Walsh. You clean up rather well yourself." His smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners in a way that made her heart flutter. "Been saving those dancing shoes, as promised." She took his offered arm, aware of the curious glances from townspeople as he led her toward the dancing area. The music shifted to a waltz as they reached the cleared space. Zachary hesitated for just a moment before placing his hand at her waist, taking her other hand in his. Grace was surprised at how naturally they moved together, her years of dancing lessons in Boston matching his unexpected grace. "Where did a frontier deputy learn to waltz?" she asked, genuinely curious. A shadow crossed his face. "Before the war, my mother insisted my brother and I learn. Said no son of hers would embarrass a lady on a dance floor." His expression softened. "Haven't danced since then. Wasn't sure I remembered how." "You remember beautifully," Grace said softly. As they danced, the rest of the festival seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them moving together in perfect harmony. When the music ended, Zachary didn't immediately release her. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you." Before he could continue, a commotion at the edge of the square caught everyone's attention. A rider had arrived, dust-covered and urgent, heading straight for the sheriff. Zachary's expression changed instantly, the deputy replacing the dancer as he hurried toward the newcomer, Grace following close behind. "Apache raid," the rider was saying, breathless. "Hit the Miller place about an hour ago. They're heading this way." The festive atmosphere evaporated. Men rushed for weapons, women gathered children, and the sheriff began barking orders. Zachary turned to Grace, his expression grim. "Get to the hotel. Stay there until I come for you." "Zachary, please," he cut her off. "I can't focus if I'm worried about you." The raw concern in his eyes silenced her protests. She nodded, squeezing his hand once before hurrying toward the hotel with the other women and children. The next hours were the longest of Grace's life. From the hotel windows, she watched as the men of Prescott organized their defense, positioning themselves at strategic points throughout the town. Shots were fired in the distance, then silence, then more shots. Mrs. Holcomb led the women in preparing bandages and boiling water, their faces tense but determined. "He'll be all right," Mrs. Holcomb said quietly, catching Grace staring out the window. "That man survived worse than this, I'd wager." "How can you be sure?" Grace whispered. The older woman patted her hand. "Because he has something to come back to now." It was well past midnight when the all-clear finally came. The Apache raiding party had been driven off, though 2 outlying farms had been burned and 3 townsmen wounded. Grace waited anxiously as men filed back into town, scanning each face for the one she most needed to see. When Zachary finally appeared, his shirt was torn and blood stained his sleeve, but he was walking under his own power. Grace rushed to him, propriety forgotten as she threw her arms around him. "You're hurt," she said, drawing back to examine his arm. "Just a graze. I've had worse shaving." His attempt at humor fell flat as he winced. "Let me help you," she insisted, leading him to a chair and carefully rolling up his sleeve. The wound was indeed shallow, but it still needed cleaning. As she worked, their eyes met, and in that moment, all the words they hadn't yet said to each other seemed to pass between them. "What were you going to tell me?" Grace asked softly. Before the rider came, Zachary covered her hand with his. "That I love you, Grace Keller. Have since somewhere between carrying you through the desert and watching you stand on your own 2 feet again." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "Never thought I'd find a home again after the war, but I have. It's with you." Grace's heart soared. "I love you too, Zachary, more than I thought possible." His free hand came up to cup her cheek. "I'm not a wealthy man, can't offer you fine things or an easy life." "I don't want fine things," she whispered. "I want you." When he kissed her, right there in the crowded hotel parlor with half the town looking on, Grace knew she had truly found her place in the world. They were married 2 weeks later in Prescott's small church with Mrs. Holcomb dabbing at her eyes in the front pew, and the sheriff standing as Zachary's best man. Grace wore a simple white dress and carried wildflowers gathered by her students. Zachary, despite his protests about discomfort in formal wear, cut a striking figure in his new suit. The entire town turned out for the celebration afterward, the trauma of the Apache raid temporarily set aside as they embraced a moment of joy in their community. The sheriff presented them with a deed to a small piece of land just outside town. "Town council voted," he explained. "Figure our teacher and deputy deserve a proper home. It's not much, couple acres, old cabin needs work, but it's a start." Grace and Zachary exchanged glances, both overwhelmed by the gesture. "Thank you," Zachary said, his voice rough with emotion. "This means more than you know." That night, as they walked from the celebration to the hotel where they would spend their first night as husband and wife, Zachary suddenly stopped in the middle of the darkened street. "What is it?" Grace asked, concerned. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest just as he had that first day in the desert. "Zachary," she laughed. "What are you doing? I can walk perfectly well now." He smiled down at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Just remembering how our story began. Wanted to properly finish that chapter before we start the next one." As he carried her across the threshold of their room, Grace wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Carry me as long as you want, Zachary Walsh, but remember I'll always choose to walk beside you." Spring, 1879. The Arizona desert bloomed with unexpected color as Grace tended to the small garden behind their cabin. The winter had been harsh but transformative. Zachary had worked tirelessly to make the old cabin habitable, adding a proper bedroom, reinforcing the roof, and building furniture with his own hands. Grace had continued teaching at the schoolhouse in town. Riding in each morning on the mare Zachary had bought her as a wedding gift. Life wasn't easy. Apache raids remained a constant threat, and Zachary's duties as deputy often took him away for days at a time, tracking outlaws or escorting prisoners to the territorial capital. But the time between was filled with a contentment neither had expected to find in this life. "Those tomatoes coming along?" Zachary asked, coming up behind Grace and wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, enjoying the solid warmth of his chest. "Another few weeks, I think. The children's garden at the schoolhouse is doing even better." "Town's lucky to have you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I'm luckier still." Grace turned in his arms, studying his face. The month since their wedding had softened something in him. He smiled more easily now, laughed more freely. The shadows that had haunted his eyes when she first met him hadn't disappeared entirely, but they'd receded. "I have news," she said, suddenly nervous. Zachary raised an eyebrow. "Good news, I hope." Grace took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "The best kind." His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Where?" She nodded, tears of joy welling in her eyes. "Dr. Morgan confirmed it yesterday. He says the baby should arrive by late autumn." For a moment, Zachary stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Then, to Grace's astonishment, he let out a whoop that surely could be heard all the way to town, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Careful," she laughed. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember," he set her down gently, his face alight with wonder and joy. "A baby," he breathed, placing his hand reverently back on her stomach. "Our baby." As summer stretched into autumn, Grace's body changed with the seasons. She continued teaching until the school board insisted she take leave 2 months before her due date. Zachary grew more protective, checking constantly that she wasn't overexerting herself, riding into town at midday just to bring her lunch at the schoolhouse. "You're hovering, Deputy Walsh," she teased one evening as he insisted on carrying the water bucket from the well, refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a book. "Guilty as charged, Mrs. Walsh," he replied, unrepentant. "Figure I earned the right when I carried you across half the territory." She laughed, stretching up to kiss his cheek. "I suppose you did at that." Their son, Thomas James Walsh, was born on a crisp November morning after a long and difficult labor. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Grace's exhausted arms, she looked up to see tears streaming unashamedly down Zachary's face. "He's perfect," Zachary whispered, his finger engulfed by his son's tiny grip. "Strong like his mother." Grace smiled tiredly. "And handsome like his father." As winter settled over the territory, the little family found a rhythm to their days. Zachary took on more work at the ranch to supplement his deputy's pay, determined to provide for his growing family. Grace recovered her strength and began planning for when she would return to teaching in the spring, little Thomas in a basket beside her desk. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire in their small cabin, Thomas asleep in his cradle nearby. Outside, a rare desert snow had begun to fall, dusting the landscape with white. "I have something for you," Zachary said, reaching into his pocket. "Not much, but—" He placed a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. Grace unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver bracelet, simple but beautifully crafted with a single turquoise stone set in the center. "Zachary, it's lovely," she breathed. "But how?" "Been saving a little from each month's pay," he admitted. "Had the silversmith in town make it special." He helped her fasten it around her wrist. "Wanted you to have something beautiful, something that reminds you of the sky out here." Grace touched the stone, moved beyond words. Then she reached for a small package hidden beneath her chair. "I have something for you as well." Zachary unwrapped the gift to find a pocket watch, gleaming silver with his initials engraved on the case. When he opened it, he found a tiny photograph inside Grace holding Thomas, both smiling at the camera. "Had it taken when I was in town last week," she explained. "So no matter where your duties take you, we're always with you." Zachary stared at the image for a long moment, then pulled Grace into a tender kiss. "Best Christmas gift I could ask for," he murmured against her lips, "though you already gave me the greatest gift of all this year." As if on cue, Thomas stirred in his cradle, letting out a small cry. Grace moved to tend to him, but Zachary was already on his feet. "I'll get him," he said, lifting his son with practiced gentleness. He brought the baby back to their fireside chair, cradling him in one arm while extending the other to Grace. She nestled against him, her head on his shoulder, their son between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the harsh desert in a blanket of white. Inside, the little family remained warm, surrounded by a love that had begun with an act of simple humanity on a dusty trail and grown into something neither had dared dream possible. Zachary gazed down at his wife and son, marveling at how much his life had changed in a single year. From a solitary drifter to a husband and father, from a man haunted by the past to one looking toward the future. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked softly, noticing his distant expression. "Just that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "If you hadn't collapsed on that trail, if you hadn't stopped to help a stranger, if you hadn't been strong enough to walk beside me afterward." Grace smiled up at him. "Then we wouldn't be here now." "No," Zachary agreed, tightening his arm around her. "And here is exactly where I want to be." As the fire crackled and their son drifted back to sleep, they sat together in contented silence. Two souls who had found in each other not just love, but home. "Spring, 1885, Papa, look what I found." Zachary looked up from mending the corral fence to see his 6-year-old son running toward him, something clutched carefully in his small hands. Behind him came Grace, walking more slowly with their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, balanced on her hip. "What have you got there, Thomas?" Zachary asked, setting down his hammer. The boy opened his hands to reveal a tiny desert tortoise, no bigger than a silver dollar. "Can I keep him, please?" Zachary exchanged an amused glance with Grace as she approached. "Well now, that tortoise probably has a mama somewhere wondering where he's got to," he explained gently. "But we can build him a little home in the garden to visit." Thomas considered this compromise with all the seriousness a 6-year-old could muster before nodding decisively. "All right. But I get to name him." "Seems fair," Zachary agreed, ruffling his son's dark hair so like his own. Grace set Elizabeth down, and the little girl immediately toddled to her father, arms raised in a wordless demand to be picked up. Zachary obliged, swinging her onto his shoulders where she giggled delightedly. "The garden looks wonderful," Grace remarked, surveying their expanded homestead with pride. What had once been a small cabin on a few acres had grown into a proper ranch. The original cabin was now just the front room of a larger house, built gradually over the years as their family and prosperity had grown. Fields of vegetables stretched behind it, and a small orchard of fruit trees was beginning to bear. A corral held their horses and milk cow, and in the distance, a modest herd of cattle grazed on land Zachary had purchased from neighboring ranchers who'd given up and moved on. He was still a deputy, but the role was more administrative now, as Prescott had grown large enough to support a proper sheriff's office with multiple deputies. Grace had returned to teaching after each of their children was born, though she now taught only 3 days a week, devoting the rest of her time to their home and children. "School board wants to talk to you," Zachary mentioned as they walked back to the house together, Thomas running ahead with his tortoise, Elizabeth still perched on her father's shoulders. "Something about expanding the school next year. They're hoping you'll take on the position of headmistress." Grace looked up in surprise. "Really? They didn't mention anything to me. Sheriff Henderson let it slip when I was in town yesterday. Think they're planning to make it official at the next town meeting." He smiled at her proudly. "Told you they recognized how valuable you are." Grace squeezed his arm, touched by his unwavering support. From the day they'd met, he'd encouraged her independence, her education, her desire to contribute to their community so different from the men she'd known back east who expected women to be merely decorative. "We should invite everyone for Sunday dinner to celebrate," she suggested. "Mrs. Holcomb would never forgive us if she heard the news secondhand." Zachary laughed. That woman's still convinced she personally arranged our marriage. Didn't she, though? Grace teased. All those accidental meetings, all those times she sent you to escort me home. Didn't need much encouraging, Zachary admitted, his eyes softening as he looked at her. Even after years of marriage and 2 children, Grace still found herself breathless under that gaze, the look of a man who saw beyond her surface to the very heart of her. That Sunday, their home filled with friends who had become family. Mrs. Holcomb, now gray-haired but still sprightly, brought her famous apple pie. Sheriff Henderson and his wife came with their 3 children, who immediately ran off to play with Thomas. The young doctor who had delivered both their children arrived with his new bride. Even the town's mayor made an appearance, officially offering Grace the position of headmistress for Prescott's expanded school. As Grace moved among their guests, serving food and filling glasses, she caught sight of Zachary standing by the fireplace, deep in conversation with the sheriff. He looked up, as if sensing her gaze, and smiled that same smile that had first warmed her heart in the desert all those years ago. Her Zachary, older now, with streaks of silver at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes, but still the same man who had carried her when she couldn't walk, who had seen something worth saving in a half-dead stranger on a desert trail. Later, as the last guests departed and the children were tucked into bed, Grace and Zachary sat on the porch swing he had built the previous summer. The desert night spread before them, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast sky. Zachary's arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, his fingers absently playing with a strand of her hair. "I had a letter from San Francisco yesterday," Grace said after a comfortable silence. "From the school board there." Zachary turned to look at her, eyebrows raised in question. "They're still looking for teachers," she continued, "offering twice what I make here." A shadow crossed Zachary's face. "You thinking of accepting?" Grace laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Not for all the money in California." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Just thinking how differently things might have turned out. If I'd made it to that wagon train, if I hadn't collapsed on that trail, if you hadn't found me. If you hadn't been so stubborn about walking beside me instead of letting me carry you the whole way," Zachary added with a chuckle. "I think that's when I first started falling in love with you," Grace admitted. "When you didn't insist on carrying me, when you respected my determination to recover my own strength." Zachary pressed a kiss to her temple. "And I think I started falling for you the moment you opened those green eyes and looked at me like I was either your savior or your doom." "You were both, as it turned out," she said softly. "You saved me from death on that trail, and you doomed me to a life of loving a stubborn, honorable man who insists on taking the most dangerous assignments the sheriff offers." "Not anymore," Zachary said, surprising her. "Told Henderson today I'm ready to retire from deputy work, focus on the ranch full-time." Grace sat up, searching his face. "Are you certain? You've always said the badge is part of who you are." Zachary shook his head. "It was part of who I was. A man searching for purpose, for a way to bring order to chaos." He cupped her cheek in his palm. "I found what I was really looking for the day I found you, Grace. Everything since has just been figuring that out." "And what was that?" she asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Home," he said simply. "A place to belong, people to love who love me back." He glanced at the house behind them, where their children slept peacefully. A family. Grace leaned forward to kiss him, pouring 7 years of love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "Thank you for finding me, Zachary Walsh." "Thank you for walking beside me, Grace Walsh," he replied, "every step of the way." As the desert night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms. Two souls who had found in the harshest of circumstances the greatest of blessings, a love strong enough to carry them through whatever lay ahead. Autumn 1902. The town of Prescott had changed dramatically in the 24 years since Grace had first arrived, carried in the arms of a stranger who would become the center of her world. What had been a frontier settlement was now a proper town, with brick buildings replacing many of the wooden structures, electric lights illuminating the main street, and even a telephone exchange connecting it to the wider world. The Walsh Ranch had prospered as well, growing from those initial few acres to one of the most successful operations in the county. Their house had expanded several times over to accommodate their growing family. Thomas and Elizabeth had been joined by two more siblings, Samuel, now 15, and Rebecca, 12. Today, the house was filled with activity as preparations were made for a special celebration. Tomorrow would mark the 23rd anniversary of the day Zachary had found Grace collapsed on the trail, an occasion they had commemorated every year since their marriage. "Mama, is this enough flowers for the tables?" Rebecca asked, coming in from the garden with an armful of late-blooming wildflowers and cultivated roses. "They're perfect, darling," Grace assured her, tucking a strand of auburn hair now liberally streaked with silver behind her ear. "Put them in water for now, and we'll arrange them in the morning." At 52, Grace retained much of the beauty that had first caught Zachary's eye, though time and the harsh desert climate had left their marks. Laugh lines framed her still vibrant green eyes, and her hands showed the evidence of years of hard work building a home and raising a family. "Pa's back," Samuel called from the front window, "and Thomas is with him." Grace hurried to the door, her heart lifting at the sight of her husband and eldest son riding side by side up the long drive to the ranch house. Thomas, now 23, had been away at university in Denver, following his mother's footsteps into education. His visit was a surprise. They hadn't expected him until next month. Zachary, at 54, sat tall in the saddle despite the old wound in his left shoulder that troubled him in cold weather, a souvenir from his last year as deputy, before retiring to ranch full-time. His dark hair was more silver than not now, and the desert sun had deepened the lines on his weathered face, but his blue eyes still carried the same intensity, the same capacity for tenderness that had been there from the beginning. "Look what I found wandering around the station in town," Zachary called as they dismounted. "Some educated fellow claiming to be our son." Thomas laughed, striding forward to embrace his mother. "Surprise, Ma. Couldn't miss the anniversary, could I?" Grace hugged him fiercely, then stepped back to examine him. "You're too thin. Don't they feed you at that university?" "Not like you do," Thomas admitted, his grin so like his father's that it made Grace's heart ache with love for them both. Zachary moved to stand beside her, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "Your mother's been cooking for 3 days. Good thing you showed up. We'd have been eating leftovers for a month." "Where's Lizzie?" Thomas asked, looking around for his older sister. "In town with her husband and the baby," Grace explained. "They'll be here tomorrow for the celebration." Elizabeth had married the town doctor's son 2 years earlier, making Grace and Zachary grandparents to a cherubic little boy named David. The young family lived in town, where Elizabeth assisted her husband in his medical practice, having inherited her mother's interest in healing. That evening, the Walsh family gathered around the large oak table Zachary had crafted years ago when they'd expanded the house. The conversation flowed easily, catching Thomas up on local news, hearing about his studies and his plans after graduation. Samuel peppered his older brother with questions about city life, while Rebecca proudly showed off the quilt she was making for her school project. As Grace looked around at the family she and Zachary had built, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. None of this would exist if a lone cowboy hadn't stopped to help a stranger on a desert trail all those years ago. After the younger children had gone to bed, Thomas, Grace, and Zachary sat on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air. Thomas had brought a bottle of fine whiskey from Denver as an anniversary gift, and the three of them sipped it slowly from crystal glasses, another gift, this one from Mrs. Holcomb on their 20th anniversary before she passed peacefully in her sleep the following winter. "I've been thinking," Thomas said after a comfortable silence, "about what you two always tell us about how you met, about destiny and serendipity and all that." "Oh," Zachary raised an eyebrow. "And what conclusions have your university-educated thoughts reached?" Thomas smiled, unfazed by his father's teasing. "That you were right. That sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as something else entirely." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "There's a girl in Denver, Margaret. She's studying to be a physician." Grace and Zachary exchanged a knowing look. "Is that so?" Grace said carefully, trying not to sound too eager. "She's brilliant," Thomas continued, his expression softening. "Stubborn, too. Determined to practice medicine even though half the faculty thinks women shouldn't be doctors." "Sounds like she has spirit," Zachary commented. "When do we get to meet this paragon?" Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "Actually, she's coming here next week, if that's all right. She's interested in learning about frontier medicine, and I thought, well, with Lizzie's husband being the town doctor." "Of course it's all right," Grace assured him. "We'd be delighted to meet her." Later, after Thomas had retired to his old room and the house had settled into nighttime silence, Grace and Zachary stood together in their bedroom. Through the window, the desert spread before them, silver in the moonlight. "Another doctor in the family, perhaps," Zachary mused as he helped Grace with the buttons of her dress, a small ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. "Perhaps," Grace agreed. "He certainly seems smitten. Can't blame him there. Walsh men have good taste in strong-willed women." Zachary pressed a kiss to the nape of her neck. Grace turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his beloved face. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day? If you'd chosen a different trail or ridden past without stopping?" Zachary considered her question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I think about how many things had to align exactly right for us to find each other in all that vastness." His eyes held hers. "Makes me believe some things are meant to be no matter what." Grace smiled, remembering the half-dead woman she had been and the solitary man who had saved her. Who would have thought that day would lead to all this? A ranch, 4 children, a grandchild. "A dynasty in the making," Zachary said with a wink, drawing her closer. "And it all started because a beautiful woman couldn't walk on her own. And a stubborn cowboy insisted on carrying her until she could," Grace finished, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. The next day dawned clear and bright, perfect for their anniversary celebration. By midday, the ranch was filled with family and friends. Elizabeth and her husband arrived with baby David, who was immediately scooped up by his doting grandparents. Neighbors from surrounding ranches brought dishes to share, and even the current Sheriff Henderson's son, who had taken over when his father retired, made an appearance. As had become tradition, Zachary and Grace took a moment during the celebration to tell the story of how they met to the younger generation. Though their older children and close friends had heard it many times, there were always new listeners' spouses, children, new friends who had moved to the area. "It was 1878, Zachary began, his arm around Grace's shoulders as they sat together on the porch steps. I was heading to Prescott to meet a friend who had worked for me. Wasn't planning on picking up any strays along the way. The children gathered around them giggled at this familiar opening. I'd been separated from my wagon train during an Apache raid, Grace continued, picking up the story. Had been wandering for days without proper water or food. By the time your father found me, I was at death's door. Prettiest almost corpse I ever saw, Zachary interjected, earning a playful swat from Grace and more laughter from their audience. They took turns recounting the tale how Zachary had carried Grace for days, until she was strong enough to walk beside him. How they had fallen in love during the journey to Prescott. How they had built a life together from those unlikely beginnings. The moral of the story, Zachary concluded, as he always did, is that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments. And sometimes the person you're meant to love forever is someone you haven't even met yet. And, Grace added, squeezing his hand, that when someone offers to carry you through the hard times, it's all right to let them as long as you're determined to walk beside them when you can. As the afternoon lengthened into evening, the celebration continued with music and dancing in the large barn that Zachary and his sons had decorated with lanterns and ribbons. Elizabeth's husband played the fiddle, accompanied by Samuel on the harmonica, while the others clapped and stomped along. Zachary drew Grace into a dance, their movements still in perfect harmony after all these years. As they twirled among their family and friends, Grace caught glimpses of the life they had built together. Thomas deep in conversation with the sheriff, probably discussing politics. Elizabeth dancing with her husband, their eyes still full of newlywed adoration. Samuel teaching a neighbor girl a new dance step. Rebecca and her friends giggling in a corner. "Happy?" Zachary asked softly, his eyes crinkling as he smiled down at her. "Completely," Grace answered and meant it. "More than I ever dreamed possible when I set out from Boston all those years ago." As the music slowed, Zachary pulled her closer. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For collapsing on my trail," he replied with a wink. "Best thing that ever happened to me." Grace laughed, the sound as bright and clear as it had been when she was a young woman. "And thank you for being stubborn enough to carry me until I could walk on my own." "Easiest burden I ever carried," Zachary said seriously. "And the most worthwhile." As the celebration continued around them, Grace and Zachary slipped away, walking hand in hand to the ridge beyond their property. From this vantage point, they could see for miles across the desert landscape, harsh, beautiful, and endlessly vast. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, silhouetting the distant mountains. "Still like it here?" Zachary asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Ever miss the East, the city, the convenience of it all?" Grace considered the question, gazing out at the wild landscape that had become more home to her than the prim streets of Boston had ever been. "Not for a moment," she answered honestly. "This is where I belong, where we belong." Zachary nodded, understanding completely. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "What do you think the next 23 years will bring?" Grace asked eventually. "More grandchildren, I expect," Zachary replied. "Thomas seems serious about his Margaret. Samuel's got his eye on the Henderson girl. Before long, this place will be overrun with little Walshes." "I hope so," Grace said softly. "I want to see what they all become, who they choose to love, what lives they build." "We will," Zachary assured her, pulling her close against the evening chill. "Together." As they turned to walk back to their home, where light and laughter spilled from every window, Grace thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From a half-dead stranger and a solitary cowboy to the patriarch and matriarch of a growing dynasty. Their story had unfolded in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day on the desert trail. "I love you, Zachary Walsh," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of their shared history, their present joy, and their future hopes. "And I love you, Grace Walsh," he replied, his voice still holding the power to make her heart skip a beat after all these years. Always have, always will. Hand in hand, they walked back to the celebration, to the family they had created, to the life they had built together, all because a cowboy had found her collapsed on a trail and carried her until she could walk beside him.